Oh sure, because nothing says routine diplomatic survey mission like stumbling across a planet where the apex predators walk upright, argue with each other constantly, and somehow run everything. My name is Frairen Field Analyst, 3rd rank, assigned to Sector 9 of the Galactic Observation Bureau. And before you ask, no, I did not volunteer for this assignment. I was voluntold. There is a difference, and that difference lives in the expression on Commander Voss's face when he hands you a data pad and says, "You'll find it fascinating," in a tone that clearly means, "You will suffer," but scientifically. The planet in question, designated ER-114 by the Bureau. The locals call it Earth, and yes, before you laugh, I already laughed. The name sounds like someone sneezed mid-sentence and decided to commit to it. I had been briefed, of course. Everyone in the Bureau gets briefed before a surface assignment. They show you the holo charts, the population density maps, the atmospheric readings. They describe the creatures. They say words like bipedal, carbon-based, and emotionally unpredictable. What they do not prepare you for, and I want this on the official record, is the noise. The drop pod hit the surface at precisely 0432 local time, in a region the humans called the suburbs. I had chosen this landing zone specifically because the data suggested low population activity during nighttime hours. Quiet, safe, manageable. What the data did not mention was that even at 0432, even in quiet suburbia, one of these creatures would be standing in their front garden, wearing a bathrobe that had clearly seen better decades, holding a cup of something steaming, staring directly at my cloaked pod with the expression of someone who had already decided not to be impressed. I activated the bioscan. Female human, adult, approximately 43 years of age, heart rate calm. Brain activity elevated but not in the panic range, not running, not screaming, just watching. I ran a secondary scan because the first one had to be wrong. It was not wrong. I cloaked myself fully, stepped out through the side panel, and stood about 3 meters from her, completely invisible, running every passive sensor I had. She took a slow sip of her drink, looked at the spot where the pod had landed, looked at the faint indent in her lawn, looked back at the pod, took another sip. Then she said, out loud to absolutely no one she could see, "Well, that explains the garden." I almost dropped my scanner. Her name, I later learned, was Rimiki Sarv. She was a secondary school science teacher, a certified lover of terrible puns, owner of one deeply judgmental cat named Professor Biscuit, and apparently the single most unbothered human being on the entire surface of ER-114. I should have left. My mission parameters were clear. Observe, do not engage, do not reveal, submit reports, go home. Simple. But Rimiki Sarv looked at the dent in her lawn, walked over to it, crouched down, pressed one finger into the soil like she was checking if bread dough had risen, stood back up and said, about the size of a large oven. Interesting. And I thought, against every single protocol I had been trained to respect, I have to talk to this person. I did not talk to her that night. I am not completely without restraint. I retreated to a nearby woodland area, set up a temporary field station behind what appeared to be an abandoned shed, and spent the next 4 days in proper surveillance mode. Those 4 days taught me the following things about Rimiki Sarv. 1. She woke up at 6:15 every morning, made coffee with the intensity of someone diffusing an explosive, and stood at her kitchen window for exactly 9 minutes before she was willing to interact with the rest of her world. 2. She talked to Professor Biscuit constantly, and in a completely reasonable conversational tone, as though the cat were a slightly unhelpful colleague she had made peace with years ago. 3. She taught physics, chemistry, and what the school curriculum called general science, but what Rimiki personally called an attempt to convince teenagers that the universe is not boring, which is an uphill battle every single day. 4. She had a habit of pausing mid-sentence when she was thinking hard, tilting her head exactly 14 degrees to the left, and making a very small hum sound that was somehow more expressive than most beings' full speeches. 5. On the 4th night, she walked out to her garden again, looked directly at the same spot she had been staring at 4 days prior, and said, out loud, "You're still here, aren't you?" It was not a question. I checked my cloak, fully active, undetectable by any human-grade sensor array. She could not possibly know. She absolutely knew. "I'm not going to report you," she continued, still looking at the slightly flattened grass. "I'm just saying, if you're going to watch someone for 4 days, the polite thing is to introduce yourself." I stood there, cloaked, running a rapid ethical review of my entire career. Protocol said, "Stay cloaked. Do not engage." Rimiki Sarv said, "The polite thing is to introduce yourself." Reader, I decloaked. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not reach for a phone or a weapon or even a particularly heavy garden ornament. She looked at me, and I want to describe this accurately because I included it in full detail in my official report and Commander Voss had to sit down when he read it. She looked at me the way someone looks at a slightly unusual but not entirely unwelcome houseguest. Like, oh, okay, so this is happening. I am, for context, approximately 2 meters tall, blue-gray in complexion, with 4 primary limbs, 2 secondary sensory appendages near my upper torso, and eyes that are by most carbon-based species standards quite large and mildly unsettling. I have been told I look like the concept of unnerving given physical form. Rimiki Sarv tilted her head 14 degrees to the left, made the small sound. Blue, she said. Nice, I half expected green. The movies always go with green. The movies, I said, in her language, because I had been running audio immersion for 4 days and my translation matrix was excellent, are statistically incorrect about most things related to extraterrestrial biology. She pointed at me. See, that's interesting, because that sentence implies you've seen our movies. 17 years of passive observation includes significant media consumption. I said, your cinema is fascinating, inconsistent, and deeply committed to the idea that any sufficiently advanced being would want to destroy your cities specifically. She laughed. Actually laughed, the way something genuinely catches you off guard and the sound escapes before you can be polite about it. Fair point, she said. Do you want to come in? I was about to make more coffee. This was, by every measurable metric, the most significant first contact event in the Bureau's 400-year history. It happened over coffee, in a kitchen with a slightly crooked cabinet door that Rimiki kept meaning to fix, while Professor Biscuit sat on the counter and stared at me with the specific expression of someone who had already decided I was not worth the effort of being alarmed. Her first question, once we were seated and she had wrapped both hands around her mug, was not where are you from or how did you get here or are there more of you? Her first question was, how long have you people been watching? Formally, I said, approximately 412 years. Informally, there are older records but the Bureau does not officially acknowledge them. She nodded slowly. So you were here for the plague years, and the wars, yes, and you didn't help. The non-interference protocols are very clear. She was quiet for a moment. Professor Biscuit walked across the counter, stepped directly onto my secondary sensory appendage, and walked off the other side without any visible shame. I'm not angry, Rimiki said finally. I'm just noting that your protocols would be a very difficult thing to defend in certain conversations. They are a very difficult thing to defend in most conversations. I said, I have had several of those conversations with myself over the past 4 days. She looked at me over the top of her mug. Is that why you decloaked? Because you lost the argument with yourself? I considered this, partially, I said. Also because you asked directly and it seemed rude not to. She smiled. It was the kind of smile that changes the general air quality of a room. I made a note of this in my field report and later crossed it out because I could not find the appropriate scientific vocabulary for it. Rimiki, she said, extending one hand across the table in the human greeting gesture. I extended my primary upper appendage. Frairen. Frairen, she repeated, pronouncing it almost exactly correctly on the first try, which almost no one from any species managed on the first try. Well, Frairen, I have approximately 600 questions I have to be at school by 8, and my cat is judging both of us. How do you feel about a schedule? And I thought, sitting in a human kitchen at 5 in the morning, being stared at by a cat of extraordinary opinions, I am absolutely going to be in so much trouble with Commander Voss. But I said, a schedule sounds reasonable. Over the next 3 weeks we built a rhythm, a genuinely strange, probably protocol-violating, almost certainly report-worthy rhythm. She went to work. I observed. She came home. We talked. She asked questions that were either very simple or devastatingly complicated, with nothing in between. I answered the ones I was cleared to answer, told her honestly when I was not cleared, and she respected that in a way that I found both refreshing and slightly suspicious, because in my experience beings who respected boundaries that cleanly usually had reasons. She had reasons. She told me about them on the 3rd week, sitting on her back step while the sun went down over the neighborhood and Professor Biscuit patrolled the fence line with the grave authority of a small furry general. My husband left 4 years ago, she said, without any particular drama, just putting it on the table. Said I was too focused on work, too analytical, too in my head. She paused. He was not wrong, technically, but he was not very interesting to be around either, which I think balances the equation. You are deflecting with humor, I said. I am. she agreed cheerfully. Did it work? No, she looked at me sideways. Honest, I appreciate that. She took a breath. The point is, I know what it's like to be watched and not engaged with, and when something actually shows up and says hello, even if it's a 2-meter tall blue person from somewhere in the general direction of Orion's belt, it seems rude to make them stand in the garden. I did not have an immediate response to this. My translation matrix was working perfectly. The words were not the problem. The weight behind them was something else entirely. I am not from the direction of Orion's belt, I said, because sometimes the factual detail is the only thing you can offer when the emotional content is too large to address directly. See, she said, and that is exactly the kind of response I would give. Professor Biscuit fell off the fence, got up, walked away with enormous dignity. We both watched this happen. He does that, she said. He never acknowledges it. A sound strategy, I said. She laughed again. And I thought, for the first time in a long career of careful, distant, thoroughly documented observation, that watching was a very poor substitute for actually being somewhere. 3 weeks and 4 days into what my official field log was now calling extended environmental immersion, I made the mistake of mentioning Rimiki in my weekly transmission to Commander Voss. Not extensively, just a passing reference. Something along the lines of, local contact has been established with a cooperative civilian subject who is facilitating cultural observation in a controlled domestic setting. Commander Voss read this, and then he called me directly, which he had not done in 6 months, which meant one of two things. Either something was very wrong with my report, or something was very wrong with my report. Frairen, he said, in the tone of a being who has been doing this job for 60 years and can hear a protocol violation from 3 star systems away. What exactly is a cooperative civilian subject? A human, I said. Silence. A specific human, I added, because honesty at this point seemed like the least catastrophic option. More silence. The kind of silence that has furniture in it. Are you telling me, Commander Voss said, very slowly, very carefully, that you have made personal contact with a native of ER-114, are currently residing in her geographic vicinity, and have been conducting what appears to be a regular social exchange for nearly a month? She makes very good coffee, I said. I want to be clear that I am aware this was not an appropriate response. I am also aware that I said it anyway, and I stand by the decision because it was factually accurate, and sometimes the truth is the only shield you have. Commander Voss told me I had 72 hours to either extract myself from the situation or submit a formal first contact petition, which required 47 separate documents, 3 senior signatures, and a psychological evaluation. He said this in a way that clearly communicated he expected me to extract myself, file a standard non-engagement report, and pretend the last 3 weeks had been a particularly vivid atmospheric hallucination. I told him I would consider my options. Then I went back to Rimiki's kitchen and told her everything. She listened the way she always listened, which was completely, without interrupting, with her head tilted exactly 14 degrees to the left, and her mug held in both hands like an anchor. I told her about the Bureau, about Commander Voss, about the 72-hour window, about the 47 documents. I told her about the non-interference protocols in more detail than I had shared before. I told her what happened to field analysts who violated those protocols, which was not anything dramatic or violent, but was extremely tedious administratively, which is somehow worse. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Professor Biscuit walked into the kitchen, looked at us both, and left again. This was his standard contribution to serious conversations. So, Rimiki said, you can leave, pretend this never happened, and go back to watching from a distance. Yes, or you can file 47 documents and get a psychological evaluation. Yes. How long does the petition process take? Approximately 4 months, if the Bureau is moving quickly, typically closer to 8. She nodded slowly. And while the petition is processing, I would be required to remain in the field, in a suspended operational status, which means I observe but submit no active reports. Essentially, I would be here, doing exactly what I have been doing, but with significantly more paperwork attached to it. Rimiki looked at me for a long moment. Frairen, she said, are you telling me that the bureaucratic middle option is that you stay? You just have to fill in a lot of forms. That is an accurate summary, yes. She stood up, went to the kitchen counter, opened a drawer and produced a pen and a notepad. She set them on the table in front of me. Start with document 1, she said. I'll make more coffee. I looked at the pen. I looked at the notepad. I looked at her. The documents are digital, I said. Then get your scanner out, she said, already moving toward the coffee machine. Frairen, 47 documents is just a Tuesday with extra steps. You're fine, I submitted the first contact petition at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, which meant it officially landed in the Bureau's administrative queue at the start of their Thursday processing cycle, and Commander Voss received the notification at 06 Frode Bureau Standard Time, which was, by pure coincidence, exactly when he took his morning briefing. His response came 4 hours later. It was 2 sentences long. Petition received, do not do anything else surprising, which, from Commander Voss, was essentially a standing ovation. Rimiki read his response over my shoulder and said, I like him. You have never met him. He communicates efficiently, and he didn't say no, she said. Those are 2 qualities I respect enormously. I filed the response acknowledgement, set the petition tracker to passive monitoring, and spent the rest of that evening watching Rimiki grade student assignments at her kitchen table while she explained, between red pen marks, exactly why it was physically painful to read a lab report that said the experiment worked because science. Did it at least include a conclusion? I asked. It included the word conclusion as a heading, she said, followed by one sentence that said, and I am quoting directly, we did the experiment and it went how we thought it would. That is not a conclusion. That is not a conclusion, she agreed, drawing a circle around it on the page and writing a small note that was kind in tone but very clear in expectation. This is Marcus, by the way. 15 years old, genuinely brilliant at spatial reasoning, completely convinced that writing is not a real skill. Is it a skill? I asked, because I was curious about her answer specifically. She looked up from the paper. Writing is how you tell someone what you actually think, without being able to use your face or your hands or your tone of voice to help. It is the hardest form of honesty there is. She paused, which is probably why Marcus avoids it. I made a note of this, not in my field report, in the separate personal document I had quietly started keeping, which had no official designation and was not submitted to anyone, and which contained observations that I did not have the correct scientific vocabulary for but was collecting anyway. On the 31st day, something happened that had not been in any of my briefing materials, my sensor data, my 17 years of passive observation records, or my 412-year Bureau archive. Rimiki took me to school. Not officially, obviously, not visibly. I was cloaked, which she had now become so accustomed to that she occasionally spoke to me in public under the assumption I was nearby, which was accurate and also very funny to witness from the outside. But she had been describing her classroom for weeks, describing her students, describing the specific art of trying to make a 15-year-old care about thermodynamics on a Friday afternoon. And one morning she said, you should just come and see it. You're here to observe, aren't you? Observe something real. So I cloaked, climbed into the passenger seat of her small and aggressively optimistic green car, and went to Lornfield Secondary School, which smelled like floor cleaner, and something that I believe was described on the cafeteria menu as pasta bake, but which bore a complicated relationship to that description. Her classroom was on the 2nd floor, room 14, with a door that stuck slightly in damp weather, and a window that looked out over the school's sports field, and beyond it, a line of trees that Rimiki had once told me she found reassuring to look at between lessons, because they did not require anything from her. I stood at the back, invisible, and I watched her teach. And I want to say something here, because my field reports are supposed to be objective, and this observation is not entirely objective, but I am including it anyway because I believe it is the most accurate thing I recorded during my entire posting on ER14. Rimiki Sarv walked into that room, and the energy changed. Not because she demanded it, not because she was loud or authoritative or performing, it was quieter than that. She came in like someone who was genuinely pleased to be there, which is rarer than it should be, and the students felt it, and they adjusted to it the way plants adjust to sunlight, mostly without noticing they were doing it. She had 31 students in that period. 23 of them were paying attention within the first 4 minutes, which I calculated against the Bureau's general sentient species engagement statistics and found to be exceptionally high. The remaining 8 paid attention in intervals, which she managed without drawing attention to the management, which is its own very difficult skill. She was teaching energy transfer, the specific mechanics of how heat moves between objects, how energy is never created or destroyed, only passed along, changed in form, sent onward. Energy doesn't disappear, she told them, perched on the edge of her desk in a way that her school handbook probably did not technically endorse. It just goes somewhere else, changes into something you maybe weren't expecting. The universe is very committed to not wasting anything. A student in the 3rd row, a girl with her hair pulled back and a pen she was clicking with extraordinary rhythm, raised her hand. Miss Rimiki, does that apply to everything? Like not just heat? Rimiki looked at her for a moment. What do you think, Petra? Petra considered this with the particular seriousness that some teenagers carry around like a coat that doesn't quite fit yet but will. Eventually. I think maybe yes, she said. Because things don't just stop existing, they just become different things. Write that down, Rimiki said. That's a better answer than I was going to give. I recorded this entire exchange, verbatim, timestamped. I also recorded what I noticed next, which was that after class, when the students had gone and the room was empty and Rimiki was sitting at her desk with her shoes off and her head tipped back, she looked tired in a way that was completely invisible when she was teaching, like she had been holding something up for an hour and had only just put it down. I decloaked. She did not startle. She had stopped startling around me at approximately day 9. Good class, I said. Good class, she agreed, eyes still on the ceiling. Petra is going to be something remarkable. She just doesn't know it yet. You could tell her. I do tell her, regularly. She straightened up and looked at me. But there's a difference between being told something and believing it. The believing part takes time and she has to arrive there herself. My job is just to keep the road clear. I thought about Commander Voss, who had told me I had potential in my first year at the Bureau, and then handed me increasingly difficult assignments for 30 years without explaining that the assignments were the point. That is a widely applicable philosophy, I said. Rimiki looked at me with that expression that had no official scientific vocabulary. Frairen, she said, are you telling me that your intimidating 60-year veteran commander has been doing the same thing to you? I am not confirming that, I said. You completely just confirmed that, she said. On day 41, the Bureau sent an observer, not Commander Voss, someone from the Compliance Division, a senior analyst named Thoss, who I had met twice before and found to be professionally thorough in a way that made every interaction feel like a very polite audit. Thoss arrived in a secondary pod, landed in the woodland behind the abandoned shed, and contacted me through the standard secure channel with a message that said, routine petition review, on-site assessment required, please coordinate access. I told Rimiki. She said, is he scary? He is not scary, I said. He is thorough, which is sometimes worse. She thought about this. Can he come for dinner? I transmitted this invitation to Thoss, who was silent for so long I thought the channel had dropped. Then he responded, that is not standard protocol. And I thought of Rimiki saying the polite thing is to introduce yourself. No, I transmitted back, but it is the polite thing. Another long pause. What is she making? Thoss asked. Thoss arrived at Rimiki's house at 7 p.m., cloaked and decloaked in the hallway with considerably less composure than I had managed on my first reveal, because Rimiki had apparently not warned Professor Biscuit, and Professor Biscuit took one look at Thoss and made a sound that I can only describe as personally offended. Thoss, to his credit, recovered quickly. Rimiki fed us both. She asked Thoss questions with the same calm, direct curiosity she had aimed at me on the first night, and Thoss, who had spent 40 years being professionally unreadable, answered 3 of them before he apparently noticed he was doing it and had to recalibrate. After dinner, he sat across from me in the living room while Rimiki was in the kitchen with Professor Biscuit, and he said in Bureau standard language quietly, I see why you filed the petition. She is a remarkable subject, I said carefully. Thoss gave me a long look. Frairen, he said, I have been doing compliance reviews for 31 years. I have read your file. I have read this petition, and I have now been in this house for approximately 2 hours. He paused. She is not a subject. I did not respond to this. Your petition will be approved, he said. I will personally recommend it, not because the documentation is flawless, though it is, but because what you have here is not a protocol violation. He glanced toward the kitchen where Rimiki was explaining to Professor Biscuit why he was not getting a second helping, in a tone of complete reasonableness that the cat was thoroughly ignoring. What you have here is a contact, a real one, and those are rarer than anything else we catalog. I looked at the kitchen doorway. I thought about energy that does not disappear, that only goes somewhere else, that changes into something you were not expecting. Yes, I said, they are. Rimiki came back in with 3 cups of tea, handed one to Thoss, one to me, and sat down on the floor next to Professor Biscuit, who had apparently forgiven her for the second helping situation, and was now leaning against her leg with the air of someone who had chosen to be gracious about it. So, she said, looking between us both, are we in trouble? Thoss looked at his tea, looked at me, looked at Rimiki. No, he said, I think you're just getting started.